All right, so our next speaker is James Stazicker, who's visiting UNAM right now. He's worked a lot in visual perception, visual consciousness, and he's going to talk to us about partial report consciousness and the introspective evidence.
Thanks, Nathan, and thanks for having me here. So, here's a hypothesis about consciousness. The hypothesis that consciousness requires cognition. That is, to be conscious of some information, you have to process that information cognitively. By cognition here, I don't just mean any kind of way of taking in and dealing with information. I mean a specific kind of processing of information. So, and that's the kind of processing that goes on when information is made available for a range of purposes, such as a verbal report, voluntary action planning, explicit reasoning, long-term mapping of the environment, and so on. So, to give you an example, you don't have cognition in this strong sense when information is being processed in areas of the brain dedicated to visual stimuli. You have cognition only when that information gets made available for further purposes. Now that's a very crude distinction, but I think it's at about the right level of grain for what I want to achieve here. So there are lots of hypotheses about the mechanisms of consciousness, or what makes consciousness possible, or even what consciousness is, which are specifications of the cognitive hypothesis about consciousness. For instance, Bernard Bahr's global workspace theory and its more recent descendants says that consciousness consists in information being broadcast by a system with widespread influence around the brain. Another example is David Rosenthal's higher order thought theory, that consciousness consists in having a certain kind of thought about a mental representation. Now that theory says that the kind of cognition needed has to be higher order, so it has to be about your own mental states. That's one way to endorse the cognitive hypothesis, but you can endorse the cognitive hypothesis without saying that higher order cognition, the cognition about your own mental states, is required for consciousness, as for instance the global workspace theory suggested. The idea is that for instance, your visual states are providing input to a mechanism which makes information globally available. That's what's required for consciousness. Okay, and that's one way of thinking about consciousness, one very general way of thinking about consciousness. And we can oppose that very general way of thinking about consciousness to just, in the first instance, the denial of the cognitive hypothesis, right? The claim that you can be conscious of information without processing that information cognitively. And a bit more specifically, the neuroscientist Victor Lama and philosopher Ned Block suggest that cognition of information is not required for consciousness of that information, because in fact you're conscious of more information than you process cognitively. That's the overflow hypothesis. Right? So they claim that there's more information available to you consciously than you process cognitively. That is available for a wide range of purposes. Okay. So how can we decide between these different hypotheses? Even at this very, very general level, how can we get evidence that favors one hypothesis over the other? Well, there's a basic problem here that will be familiar to those of you who know Ned Block's work. And I want to put it this way, which is slightly different from how he puts it. And I think that'll be important later on. So the basic problem is that we lack a mechanistic understanding of consciousness. That is, we lack an understanding of how, in principle, physiological or computational processes could explain consciousness, and of how, in principle, consciousness could contribute to physiological and computational processes. Right? So both how consciousness could get realized by such things and how consciousness could contribute a functional role in those terms, to physiological and computational processes. And that's just to articulate the famous or infamous explanatory gap, right, about consciousness. It's not to say that consciousness is not in the end explicable in physiological or computational terms. It's just to say that we don't currently have a way of doing the explanations. We don't have a grip on how they would go, even in principle. As a result, we lack uncontroversial physiological or computational criteria for identifying consciousness in any particular case. For uncontroversial evidence about whether someone is conscious of some information in a particular case, we have to go with the ordinary, naive, everyday criterion of their reports. Now, those reports need not be explicitly about consciousness, so I can give you a report which gives you evidence of my consciousness if I just say, that's red, right? That tells you something about my consciousness, namely that I'm visually aware of the colour, even though what I was telling you about was the world, not about myself. Similarly, I think we can count as reports for these purposes all sorts of things that are not verbal, right? If you say to me, James, point to something red, and I say, okay, well, that also counts. So with picking up the red one, and so on. Yeah, sorry, I'm not picking on you. Okay. I want to contrast consciousness in this respect, the connection between physiology and consciousness, or computational theories and consciousness. I want to contrast those with the connection between physiology and information processing, just to illustrate. So, how, in the first instance, do we recognize that an organism is processing information about its environment? Well, here's a standard way to do that in the first instance. The organism is good at getting around, right? Why do you think an organism is processing information about the layout of its environment? Well, it can navigate the environment successfully. That by itself doesn't tell us which processes in the organism are information processes, right? It doesn't tell us, for instance, whether the bloodstream should be treated as a bit of information processing. But we can move beyond that initial kind of naive way of recognizing information processing by understanding how, in principle, physiology might help to explain information processing. So here's a classic example. Ganglion cells in the retina have a center-surround structure, right? So here's an on-center, off-surround ganglion cell. If you get, roughly speaking, if you get firing in here, but not in here, so if you get stimulation in here, but not here, then you're going to get the cell to fire. And that's a classic example because, so way back in the 50s, Kuffler proposed that these cells were really apt, really suitable for processing information about edges. So as Dennis was discussing earlier, we can take, the visual system can take facts about sudden changes in luminance of the retina and use that to deduce, in effect, where the edges of objects are. And that connection between physiology and information processing is pretty intuitive. You can see how a cell with this general kind of structure would be useful for processing information about edges. So there's no explanatory gap between that bit of physiology and processing information about edges. It turns out that ganglion cells do all sorts of other stuff, and that was much too simplistic and so on, but nonetheless, it was not difficult to see how, in principle, the explanation could go. The problem is that we lack that kind of access to whether or not a state is conscious. We lack a grip on what kind of processes specified physiologically and computationally are going to be sufficient for consciousness, and we lack a grip on what kind of processes specified physiologically and computationally consciousness is going to be suitable or required to explain in terms of its functional role. As a result, I think we're stuck with report as the only uncontroversial evidence as to whether someone is conscious of something. or not. Of course, specific controversial theories will have other criteria, but we're trying to sort between those theories. So, okay. So, the obvious test cases for figuring out whether cognition of information is required for consciousness of that information are going to be cases where some information is processed just as it would be in a clear case of conscious perception, except that that information is not processed cognitively. And then we can ask, well, look, is that information of which you're conscious in such a case? If it is, then we've shown that the cognitive hypothesis is false. But of course, because in these cases, the information is not processed cognitively, it doesn't get reported. So we lack uncontroversial evidence as to whether one is conscious of the information or not. Such a case is equally consistent with the cognitive hypothesis or with the denial of the cognitive hypothesis, as long as we acknowledge that our only uncontroversial evidence of consciousness, namely report, itself requires cognition. Right? Okay. So that's the basic problem. That's basically Ned Block's methodological problem. And he thinks that partial report experiments, which I'm going to tell you more about as we continue, give us some evidence that helps to resolve this problem. So, the evidence from these experiments is said to be a reason for preferring the overflow hypothesis, the hypothesis that you're conscious of more information than you process cognitively, to the cognitive hypothesis. Now, over the last few years, various people have pointed out that, look, the evidence from these experiments is consistent with the cognitive hypothesis. There's really there's nothing here that contradicts the cognitive hypothesis. So now what Block tends to say is that, look, sure, it's consistent with the cognitive hypothesis, but given various elaborations of the partial report paradigm that I'm going to tell you more about, that have gone on in the last few years, we've got evidence such that if we adopt the methodology of asking which hypothesis is better supported, we should prefer the overflow hypothesis to the cognitive hypothesis. Now, I'm going to argue that that's simply not the case. That radically underestimates the challenge from alternative interpretations, of the partial report experiments. For deep reasons to do with basically the explanatory gap, evidence from partial report experiments could not possibly be a reason for preferring the overflow hypothesis to the cognitive hypothesis. It doesn't matter how you elaborate on the experiments, they're just not going to help. So, just to stop this being too much of a kind of getting a gestalt of things and saying, oh, well, once I've got all the evidence in place, I feel like the overflow hypothesis is a bit better. I want to be a little bit careful about how we're thinking about support for a hypothesis. So, it's a standard way of thinking about support, and I don't think anything actually turns on adopting this framework. It's important to me here, and in lots of cases actually, that the framework's just kind of a thing you can use to illustrate. I think the same things are going to shake out if we use a slightly different framework, but it helps us to be a bit rigorous. So, data supports a hypothesis if the probability of the hypothesis conditional on the data is greater than the unconditional probability of the hypothesis. Data undermine the hypothesis if the probability of the hypothesis conditional on the data is less than the unconditional probability of the hypothesis. I'm going to use the notion of absolute confirmation to capture what Block wants to say. So, a hypothesis is overall well supported, given some data, proportionally with the probability of that hypothesis conditional on the data. Right, so, the greater the probability of the hypothesis conditional on the data, the better supported it is. And Block says that conditional on these data from partial report experiments, broadly conceived, including sort of surrounding material, the probability of the overflow hypothesis is greater than the probability of the cognitive hypothesis. That's what he's saying, right? Just translated into these terms. So, what I'm going to do is argue that in partial report experiments, first, subjects' reports about the things they see could not possibly establish that the overflow hypothesis is preferable to the cognitive hypothesis. They couldn't possibly be a reason for preferring the overflow hypothesis to the cognitive hypothesis. And then I'm going to argue that, well, okay, but let's take slightly less formal reports, introspective reports, what subjects tell us about their experiences. And I'm going to argue that equally, they could not possibly constitute a reason for preferring the overflow hypothesis to the cognitive hypothesis. Just in order to organize things a little bit, I want to start by looking through some possibilities. So obviously this is just a small chunk of the space of possibilities. The idea is that an X marks something that's really improbable. So here we've got the overflow hypothesis conjoined with whatever's here, and here we've got the cognitive hypothesis conjoined with whatever's here. So suppose, for example, that information overflowing cognition, so processing of more information than you take up cognitively, occurred only in a bit of the brain that for independent reasons we think is really unlikely to be sufficient to support consciousness, like V1. So for lots of reasons I won't go into, people think, look, if something in the visual cortex is going to support consciousness, it's going to involve a V4 and so on. V1 is just too early. So suppose we discovered that there's only informational overflow, that you're only processing more information than you take up cognitively in V1, but not in V4. Well, then the overflow hypothesis will be really unlikely. Similarly, suppose that features that are characteristic of conscious perception, such as kinesia grouping, were present only when you've got information being processed cognitively. So kinesia grouping is this kind of case where you experience a triangle here formed by, as a result of the little sort of holes in the shapes here, and the fact that you experience a triangle there can help you in various tasks, as we're going to see. Suppose that effect was not, suppose we had good evidence that effect did not occur in any processes that are not cognitive. Well then, that would make it really improbable that the overflow hypothesis is true, right? Because there's this characteristic feature of how you experience things consciously, which will be present only when you are processing information cognitively. Neither of these things is true. What lots of the experiments do is effectively rule out these possibilities. So what they do is show that, well, some things that you might have had as good reasons for denying the overflow hypothesis and preferring the cognitive hypothesis, they're not true. So sure, we have some support for the overflow hypothesis here. We have some evidence without which the overflow hypothesis would be less probable. But this is never going to be the kind of thing, doing this, ruling out these kind of things, is never going to be the kind of thing that's going to give us a reason for preferring the overflow hypothesis to the cognitive hypothesis. Because we need to start out, prior to the evidence from partial report, with just thinking, okay, well, look, none of these squares on this column is more probable than any of the ones under here, right? We're trying to be neutral as to whether the overflow hypothesis or the cognitive hypothesis is neutral before we get the evidence in. And the cognitive hypothesis is itself completely neutral on the question whether there's informational overflow in V4. It's completely neutral on the question whether we get such other characteristics of consciousness other than global availability, whether we get those characteristics non-consciously, i.e. non-cognitively, or not. So just ruling out these kinds of possibilities which would really undermine the overflow hypothesis is never going to show that it's better supported than the cognitive hypothesis. I'm also going to look at a couple of things that would be really bad news for the cognitive hypothesis. And what I'm going to say about these is that, in fact, we just don't have good, evidence either way. So there's no evidence that seriously undermines the cognitive hypothesis in the way these boxes suggest. And we'll come back to those as we move on. We'll come back to this slide. So here's the partial report paradigm as used by Victor Lammer's group in Amsterdam. You're presented with a bunch of rectangles, then a blank screen, then a similar bunch of rectangles in the same positions, and throughout you have to keep fixation in the center. And your task is to say whether one of them has changed. So for instance, this one was vertical and now it's horizontal. If you get a cue to tell you which one you need to pay attention to, which if any will have changed, if you get that cue only at the end, well, you can keep track of about a maximum of about 4 items. Right, so to put it very roughly, you're going to get it right approximately half the time when you've got a stimulate. The idea is just that, well, you can't keep enough of them in your working memory in order to do the comparison. So if you get unlucky when you were focusing on, say, these 4, then it was that one was changed, so you can't tell. But you might get lucky and be focusing on this one and then it changed. Okay, all good. Obviously, you're much better at the task in this condition where the cue comes first. It tells you before this grid disappears which one you're going to have to report on. If that happens, then you're really good at it. You get it right almost all the time because you knew which one was the one that might change. The really interesting condition is condition C, where after this grid has gone, you get the cue. And basically, you're almost as good as you are in condition B. Exactly how good depends on the setup of the experiment. So even after this one has gone, information is in there, in your system, so that when you get the cue, you can think, oh, well, given that this one was vertical, I need to just check if this one's going to be horizontal or vertical. Oh, it's horizontal, great, I can do it. You can do it for almost all of the rectangles in a grid like this in condition C. So that gives us really good evidence that information about the orientation of each rectangle persists in the visual system, right? Because at this stage, when the thing was present in the environment,
sorry, how long is the time lag between different?
It's varied massively in different experiments. It's anything from about 200 milliseconds to 1.5 seconds.
Okay. The results are more or less the same. I mean, even with the
No, you get
1.5, you get most of them right.
You mean by the time lag? You mean the time between the first and the second?
Yeah.
Yeah. It depends on the kind of stimuli used as well. So sometimes you're worse at it if it takes too long. Yeah, that's true. So it depends. They do lots of different manipulations, and it all depends on how the different manipulations interact. So the thing is, when you get the cue, so when you get the grid shown to you, when it's in front of you, you don't have a cue telling you which rectangle to consult. Then the stimulus offsets, it's gone, and you get the cue. But how do you manage to consult the right rectangle? Well, it's not out there, so you must be consulting some persisting information in your visual system in order to do the comparison effectively. Lammer, Bloch, and others say that, well, look, what's going on is that you're conscious of all that persisting information in the visual system. You're conscious of more information than you take up cognitively, and Bloch characterized that in terms of conceptualization and working memory. But that's an optional way to characterize it, I think. The thing is, it's not at all clear why we should think that subjects are conscious of all that extra information, that information which is more than they can take up cognitively. Right? So they take up cognitively information about 4 rectangles, they can hold that in their working memory. More information than that is in the system, but why think they're conscious of that information? After all, only partial information about the array is processed cognitively, right? What you can report, reflecting what you process cognitively, is something like, well, look, there were 8 rectangles, and for these 4, they were, this one was vertical, this one was horizontal, this one was vertical, this one was horizontal, the other, they were just rectangles. That's what you report, that's what you can report. So the criterion of report tells us at most that that is what you're conscious of. So why think you're conscious of more information than you processed cognitively? On the face of it, we haven't yet got any way of getting round the criterion of report. The evidence so far, the evidence just from what subjects are able to say about the array, is equally consistent with the overflow hypothesis or the cognitive hypothesis. The cognitive hypothesis just has to agree, sure, look, subjects are conscious only of the information that's processed cognitively. More information than that is there in the visual system. But as a cognitive theorist, your hypothesis would be that you're conscious of information only when it's taken up out of the visual system and processed cognitively. So far, it seems to me, we're no further forward with deciding between the two theories. One thing I want to be really clear about is that this does not commit the cognitive hypothesis to any distinctive story about the information processing. So Wayne Wu says that the cognitive hypothesis entails a decay of information, which is not entailed by the overflow hypothesis. He suggests this in his book, Attention, which I think is an excellent book, although I disagree with him. So he thinks there's an explanatory burden on the cognitive hypothesis, some reason for preferring the overflow hypothesis, because the cognitive hypothesis has to commit to this idea that the machinery of phenomenology, as he puts it, sort of loses information. But no. The point is that in terms of the information processing story, the overflow hypothesis and the cognitive hypothesis say exactly the same thing. They both say that only partial information is processed cognitively. The cognitive hypothesis says, yeah, that's what you're conscious of. So the question is not about whether there's some kind of decay of information in the information processing hierarchy. Everyone thinks there is. You lose information when you go to cognition. The question is just, where in that hierarchy does consciousness begin? How long have I taken? Oh, wow, okay.
You have another 15 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to skip the stuff about early vision and just go on to this nice case. So this is from Victor Lammert's group in Amsterdam again, and they use the Kinesa grouping to try to show, as they put it, that the representations underlying sensory memory, so memory with its basis in the visual cortex rather than in cognition, is phenomenal, it's phenomenological. So what they do is they do the same experiment as before, but with this kind of stimulus. And basically when you have this kind of stimulus, the Kinesa stimulus, it makes it easier to remember the arrangement of the individual pieces, right? This one, I don't know how they were arranged, it's too difficult. But when you've got the triangle, that aids memory of the fact that you had them all shaped like that. Now, I'm giving you just a brief snapshot of all the evidence they produce to suggest that you get this advantage in cortical processing, in V4 in particular, rather than in working memory. But the idea is that in the visual cortex, in areas dedicated to visual processing, you've got a representation which is treating this as a triangle, or at least which is giving you the advantage of seeing this as a triangle. And Van den Broek and colleagues want to say, look, so given that Kinesa grouping is a characteristic feature of conscious perception, that's clearly evidence that you've got conscious perception in that stuff going on in the visual cortex, which is overflow in cognition. But I think that gets things completely the wrong way around. If there were no Kinesa grouping in stuff going on in the visual cortex, if Kinesa grouping happened only in cognition, that would be really bad for the overflow hypothesis. hypothesis, because you'd have a mark of conscious perception, something that is a feature of conscious perception, which couldn't be explained without saying that cognition is involved. But showing that that's not the case, that you get kinesis grouping in the cortex, doesn't in any way undermine the cognitive hypothesis. Well, sorry, I should put that more precisely. It doesn't undermine the cognitive hypothesis relative to the overflow hypothesis, because the cognitive hypothesis is absolutely fine with any feature whatsoever of conscious perception, except for global availability being present in the visual cortex. The cognitive hypothesis says only that what you need in order to be conscious is for that information to be taken up and broadcast globally or used for general purposes, available for general purposes. So, and Van den Broek realised that this bit of evidence about kinesis grouping hardly decides the case. They say, look, sure, we would need lots more evidence of this kind in order to claim that we had really got strong support for the overflow hypothesis. They say, obviously, to warrant the conclusion that sensory memory, that is sort of visual cortical memory, holds items in a fully perceptual or even conscious status would require more evidence. Many dimensions of perceptual quality, not just kinesis grouping but others, would have to be compared between sensory memory and unequivocally conscious representations. Only when sensory and accessed or cognitively accessed representations are similar in many or all perceptual dimensions, the conclusion is warranted that sensory memory is a remnant of conscious vision. But the point is that you can have as many features of that kind as you like, as many features which are characteristic of conscious information other than global availability. They could all be shown to be present in the visual cortex. And, well, all we'd have done would be to show that there wasn't something which undermines the overflow hypothesis in the way I've described. We wouldn't have come up with a reason for preferring the overflow hypothesis to the cognitive hypothesis. Because we started out with this space of possibilities, and we're saying, well, look, the most probable in here shouldn't be said to be more probable than the most probable in here, or vice versa, right? Because we're starting out being neutral on that. Well, so now we've got ourselves into the position where we can see that, okay, so it's not like this, right? But the cognitive hypothesis made no prediction as to whether kinesis grouping or other perceptual qualities would be present in precognitive processing. It was simply silent on that. It just said that when information is globally available, that's what you need for consciousness. So there's no way we're going to find evidence here for preferring the overflow hypothesis to the cognitive hypothesis. And there are lots of other elaborations of the partial report paradigm, including elaborations to do with the processing of color information and so on, which work in a similar kind of way. They show that lots of stuff like detailed color vision that we ordinarily get in conscious perception is done independently of cognition. And from there argue that we've got support for the idea that you're conscious of information independently of cognition. But the same response is going to apply. So do I have about
10 minutes.
Okay. So maybe we could come back to the color case later on if people want to talk about it. But I want to leave myself enough time to talk about introspection. So I've given you the gist of why I think there's no way that elaborations of the partial report paradigm are going to help. So now I want to, if we focus on the information that subjects report about the environment. And that's the information that's formally gathered in the experiments. But there are lots of more informal reports about experiences that Bloch and others want to appeal to in this context. So I want to now focus on the idea that introspective reports about consciousness in the context of partial report experiments could somehow show that the overflow hypothesis is better supported than the cognitive hypothesis. Because that too, I think, is just simply a mistake. So the idea is that there are certain characteristics of cognition, such as variable and substantial non-specificity, which you can introspect as being absent in cases of conscious perception. So, just to give you an example, if I were to ask you now to report on the shirts of the people over the other side of the room, drawing on what you've processed cognitively, what you could tell me would be pretty rough, right? Unless you're very interested in fashion. And so, and actually, Yuan's an exception to this. So, it's characteristic of cognition that it gives us that kind of generic information about things without carrying the specific details. If it were introspectable, that conscious perception were not like that, then even before we do any partial report experiments, the cognitive hypothesis would be in trouble, right? Because the cognitive hypothesis says you have to process information cognitively in order to be conscious of it. But, so I'm missing half of my slides because I put much more in than I can cover. I want to focus on what Bloch says about the partial report experiments in particular. Let's set aside the fact that this doesn't really turn on the experiments. So Bloch says that this thing that you people like you, James, are committed to, conscious representations of non-square rectangles that do not specify, so the representations do not specify between horizontal and vertical, is difficult to accept. He says that's difficult to accept. Now, a cognitive representation of such a rectangle is not hard to accept, right? I'm going to give you one right now. At home, I have a rectangle. I haven't told you whether it's vertical or horizontal. You have a cognitive representation of such a thing. Bloch seems to think that on introspective grounds, conscious perception with that kind of content is implausible. And similar comments apply pari passu to the stuff about colour. So is there introspective evidence that visual consciousness of a rectangle that's presented for a brief time outside focal attention, that consciousness specifies between horizontal and vertical orientations, even when you don't process that information about whether it's horizontal or vertical cognitively, right? That's the test case we've got. Bloch wants to say, look, it's implausible introspectively that you experience those rectangles for which you don't know whether they're horizontal or vertical. It's implausible that your conscious perception does not specify between horizontal and vertical. Now let's accept that, look, when things are outside focal attention, there's sort of enough capacity to attend to them to be able to introspect those aspects of your experience. Let's just waive that issue. Still, introspection would have to have a really surprising structure, I think, or on the face of it, a surprising structure, if it were to support the overflow hypothesis in this kind of way. So the idea is that introspection allows you to take up in cognition the fact that some specific information is being experienced about the rectangle, even though you don't take up that information cognitively, right? So you're aware that your conscious perception says that the thing is either vertical or horizontal. It says, specifies between those two, even though you haven't taken up in cognition the information that it's vertical or the information that it's horizontal, right? That's what would have to happen if introspection were to favour the overflow hypothesis in this context. It would have to be that even though you don't take up the information about it being vertical, for instance, cognitively, introspection allows you to cognitively process the fact that the conscious perception does specify between the two orientations. So what would introspection have to be like in order for that to be the case? In order for introspection to give you the fact that your awareness is specific, even when it doesn't give you the specific information itself? Well, the only model I know of that could explain this takes the idea of mental paint really unusually seriously. It says, the model says, look, when you introspect your experience, what happens is that you're aware of some thing in the mind that carries the representational content that the object is either horizontal or vertical. As a result of that, so it's a ground of that information being perceptually represented, something like a picture would do. So you can introspect facts about the information carried, for instance, it's being specific, without actually accessing that information itself. So here's an illustration of how that works with real paint, or a real picture, rather than mental paint. So you're going to get a stimulus down here, it's going to be a picture, and I want you to tell me whether each of the rectangles on there had a specific orientation, and also to try to tell me what the orientations are. Ready? That was 1 second. That was nearly as long as the longest ones they used. Okay. So it was like this. Now, sure, in that case, it seems to me that what you could tell me about the picture was, well, yeah, there were 8 rectangles, and they each had some orientation. I just couldn't tell you what orientation for most of them. So if introspection is like that, not looking at a picture out here, but looking at the picture in your mind, so to speak, then maybe, sure, you can say, look, I'm aware that I had a picture which specified between vertical and horizontal, but I don't know whether the things in it were vertical or horizontal. This is an unusually literal interpretation of mental paint. Sometimes people say mental paint, oh, just anything about experience, which is not a matter of what experience represents. This is much more specific. It has to be, we need something which is a ground of the information carried by conscious experience. It's the thing in your mind which carries the information, such that you can consult facts about it independently of accessing the information carried. I think just pointing out what a specific kind of view of introspection you would need to have is half the battle here, right? Lots of people say, oh, it's obvious to me that I experienced the rectangles in a way which specified between vertical and horizontal. It's obvious introspectively, even though I can't tell you whether it was vertical or horizontal. If you think that's obvious introspectively, you're implicitly committed to this kind of very specific view of introspection, which lots of people have, have denied in various ways. I want to just offer one particular reason to doubt that introspection works in this kind of way. So, this kind of view about what goes on in introspection predicts a really radical violation of the transparency of experience, which, as those of you who've had to suffer through more than one of my talks will know, I think does not occur. So, the violation of the transparency of experience would be like this. Viewing conditions of 2 stimuli are just as good or bad as one another, right? Like for 2 of the rectangles. It doesn't appear to you that those, it doesn't appear to you that those rectangles differ in shape. You can't tell that one of them's horizontal, say, and the other one's, just off horizontal or whatever it is. But you can tell that your conscious experiences of those things differed. That's effectively what Bloch's appealing to here, right? He's appealing to the fact that, I can tell that that my experience specified between vertical and horizontal. It's not much of a jump from that to say, you can tell the difference between different kinds of experiences you have. All of that independently of being able to access the information about whether the thing is vertical or horizontal. So, here's just an illustration of why I think that's wildly implausible. And in a way, this is just my argument here is it's just the kind of argument that it's modeled on the kind of argument that David Hume would make, right? So I say this never happens. That's my principle. And the classic kind of Hume thing to say would be, if you doubt that principle, then you must produce the case, right? And that's all I want to do. I want to say, look, experience is transparent in this very limited way, which this kind of appeal to introspection would violate. So for instance, look at these pairs of rectangles. The only cases where you're going to be able to introspect a difference in how the shape appears to you, the shape of the rectangle appears to you, is going to be this case, I predict, where you are able to access the information that the rectangles in fact differ in shape or orientation. So I think that the kind of view of introspection required to think that the overflow hypothesis is better supported than the cognitive hypothesis in light of the partial report experiments is both very specific and quite implausible. So here's what I think I've done. I've tried to argue that in partial report experiments, reports about visible objects of consciousness, the things you see, couldn't possibly establish that the overflow hypothesis is better supported than the cognitive hypothesis because the reports themselves are partial. They correspond to the information processed cognitively. And I've tried to argue that introspective reports about consciousness couldn't possibly establish that the overflow hypothesis is better supported than the cognitive hypothesis because this would require a radical violation of the transparency of experience, which doesn't reflect.
All right, questions? We're going to do students first and then everybody else.
Yeah, James, I wasn't very clear on the account of what kind of things is introspection working with. Is it memory? Is it another kind of cognitive information?
So, thanks, that's helpful, yeah. So I want to be kind of maximally liberal about that. I just want to say, it counts as introspection if you're telling me facts about your experience, or what appear to be facts about your experience, in a way that's independent of telling me facts about the world experienced. So for instance, even in the case of the Muller-Lyer illusion, which we were looking at earlier, if you say, well, look, I know they're equal, but they look unequal, the lines, that counts as introspection, because you're telling me about how you're experiencing things in a way which is independent of any beliefs you have about the world. So what I want to do is to distinguish between reports which get at our experiences and reports which get at the world in the first instance, and what mechanism introspection employs. I want to be completely neutral and just point out that someone who wanted to appeal to introspection in this context would have to have some quite specific ideas about the mechanism, which I think are implausible. But so I don't here want to commit to anything in particular. For what it's worth, it seems to me that most plausibly introspection is just a kind of cognition directed at your own mental states. So you think about your own mental states, and that reveals certain things to you. How that works is a complex matter. But the alternative would be that introspection is kind of like vision. Introspection is literally an inner sense and so on. If someone thinks that, fine, I don't mind. I still think that the kind of commitments you would need in order to support in order to show that the overflow hypothesis is better supported are implausible.
Thank you. I wonder if you have something more positive to say on whether do you think that we see just that this evidence doesn't support the overflow hypothesis? Do you believe in the cognition hypothesis, or is just that you don't want to take any sides right now?
I think
with the thing that you say about introspection, it seems that you might have some cognition hypothesis. I don't know, hunch.
So actually, it's important to me here that I'm not endorsing either hypothesis. All I want to do basically is to show that in order to get good evidence about this, we need to stop thinking that partial report experiments help. There are other ways of trying to get the distinction. Miguel uses evidence from dreams to try to get at it, and great. I have no beef with that. It's just this particular methodology, which has really gone wild, and since the kind of initial objections saying like this methodology doesn't really, so as Ian Phillips put it, these experiments don't show that consciousness is independent of cognition. I think it's a terrible waste of effort and money that people are pursuing this methodology for getting at this distinction. So I want to say, look, I'm completely neutral between the two hypotheses. I just want to show them that's a good position from which to show it that I've got no stake in it. It's just that the partial report experiments don't help. The more positive thing I would have said, though, if I'm so aware of the time, is that what's gone wrong here is that, it seems to me, is that we're trying to find computational roles at a kind of low level, which are distinctive of consciousness. So the Amsterdam group say things like, well, given that this is doing kinesis grouping, it must be conscious. And I think that's just a mistake. However, there are lots of roles played by consciousness that we can get a different kind of grip on. Not low-level computational roles, but roles like the fact that being conscious of something seems to play a distinctive role in enabling you to have certain kinds of thoughts. Seems to play a distinctive role in justifying you, in having beliefs about it. It seems to, so as I argue elsewhere, give you more information about the environment than you can self-diagnose. All those sorts of things, I think, are functional roles for consciousness that might ultimately push us in the direction of thinking that the overflow hypothesis is true. But that's just because they don't go with this methodology of partial report.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think that your connection between Bloch claims and the idea of mental pain is very interesting, but I think that when Bloch says that there is mental pain, he wants to be even more committal than what you, I think, than what you want to blame him. So he would be willing to accept something even more committal with regard to mental pain. Because for the idea of mental pain that is required in order to go along Bloch's considerations are just due to something like the format. So imagine that someone thinks that the representations in consciousness are picture-like. Then, beyond from what he said, if they were picture-like, I mean, I'm very happy, and I really understand what you said. There is a rectangle in my office. Now, let's say nothing about the orientation. Now, if that the kind of representation involved were somehow pictorial, then it's like, oh, how can it be a picture that has no orientation? Instead goes something on the sides. And also, so some people think that according to some ideas about what representations are, some kind of distinctions we are going to be able to have to find it in the format. So imagine that one thinks that maybe there is good reason for thinking that those are not representation, are collection of possible worlds, and we're to distinguish a representation that there is a triangle from the representation that there is a trilateral. Then one has to appeal to something like the format, and I was wondering whether there is a connection between the format, something that it has to do with format. Some way, I mean, the pictures are only one suggestion, and mental pain. And I think that there might be, and that's very interesting, but Bloch want to go beyond that by claiming that there is mental pain.
So, Frank, I think that's real. The one thing I should say is that it's fine by the likes of the cognitive hypothesis, I think, if there are pictorial representations in visual cortex in the following sense. There is, well, this is only going to be sort of a part condition, but there's a direct isomorphism between some dimensions of variation in semantically relevant values in the visual cortex and spatial layout. So the simplest form that can take is retinotopic representation in the visual cortex, where the retinotopic layout of the representation is semantically important. So suppose that in the visual cortex, once we sort of, suppose that the candidate area for consciousness is, for being the neural correlative consciousness is recurrent processing in V4, as Lama says. Suppose we flatten out your V4 on the table here, and we see, oh wow, okay. So that is, we see a shape literally laid out in the cortex corresponding to the shape that you're experiencing, corresponding to the shape that's really there. Okay. Suppose that happens. It's bound to be more complicated, but that's nice and kind of clear, neat. It's fine by the cognitive hypothesis, because suppose this is one of the rectangles that's not focally attended. So it's one of the rectangles for which cognition has only the information that it's rectangular, say, not circular, but cognition doesn't specify between its being vertical or horizontal. Fine. So far, we've got no evidence against the cognitive hypothesis, because this is in your visual cortex, and the cognitive hypothesis says what you're conscious of is just that information that you take up from the cortex. Now, just one quick thing. If you mean that the representation is pictorial, not in that sense, but in the sense that any property of the representation is a property that you experience perceptually. So that's in the tradition of the British empiricists. Then we've got no empirical evidence for that. I don't know how we could have empirical evidence for that. I don't think anyone should accept the visual representations are pictorial in that way, which would be a problem for the cognitive hypothesis. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Dennis. Two questions. They're more like invitations to say more folks are. The first one is in the 2011 paper, Block claims that he has evidence that unconscious memory isn't powerful enough to explain some of the data from the partial reported experiments.
Unconscious memory.
Mm-hmm. What's your take on that? So it would have to be conscious.
So the standard way he measures that, right, is to take cases where people say, I couldn't see it, and say, in those cases, the representations involved, the priming representations, are not powerful enough to support performance in the task. So the first thing to say is, if what's going on is that you see something, but you cannot see whether it's rectangular you cannot see whether it's vertical or horizontal, the question, did you see it, doesn't help, right? And I think part of the noise in this discussion is that Ian Phillips suggested an interpretation of the experiments where what might be going on is a kind of priming effect. Everything's going on, everything up to the judgment is going on non-consciously. He didn't quite say that, but he wasn't saying that. But the simpler thing for the cognitive hypothesis to say is, no, your answers are all based on what you experience visually. They're also all based on what's in cognition. So that stuff about non-conscious processing doesn't seem to cut there. Now, the other thing to say, the more general thing to say is, what criterion can we use for non-conscious processing? Let's set aside consciousness and just focus on the information processing. So, we know that there's information about all the rectangles being processed in the visual cortex. How powerful is that? How powerful is information in the visual cortex in other cases? Quite powerful. It enables you to perform the partial report task effectively. Now, someone can say, oh, but he couldn't do that if it wasn't conscious. Well, we'd have to already have a reason to think that you can identify consciousness independently of reports in order to make that case. So the idea that we've got some independent grip on how powerful non-conscious processing is just seems to me, for that very schematic reason, to be a non-starter. We know the information processing story, more or less, and the cognitive hypothesis is not committed to anything distinctive in there. So, yeah.
Can make a follow-up on that?
Do a follow-up, mine is different.
So just to be clear about it, so in the case that Bob mentioned is Soto's experiment. The Soto experiment, the task is to compare the orientations of two Gauss patches, so two fingers, okay? Decide whether it's clockwise or anti-clockwise, and in cases in which the subject, so there are two tasks for decide whether it's clockwise or anti-clockwise, and the second task is decide. So give a grading on whether you see the first stimuli from 0 to 5. A blog says in cases where they say 0, so definitely I didn't see it, they are better than chance. So instead of 50-50, there's something like 55. And blog says, I mean, one thing that we can say is that in this case the subject is unconscious because one thing that might happen, so you can say that it's not unconscious only if you accept the distinction between access and phenomenology. So let's accept that in this case you're unconscious, and then what you can do with these things is being slightly over the ad hoc, the 50-50. And in partial report experiment, we are much better than 50-50. So and that's how. So can you please repeat the question?
So here's the very simplest explanation for that the cognitive hypothesis should offer. Of course, we're conscious of all the items in the array. We're conscious of what we can report. What can you report? There are 8 items. That one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one. Was it vertical or horizontal? I can't tell you. So the cognitive hypothesis at no stage needs to deny that you were conscious of all items in the array, although you would have given a 0 visibility rating. It might at most predict that you're likely to give a mid-range visibility rating for some of the stimuli. And in fact, there's another experiment which does exactly the same thing, but I won't go through it. So I think part of what happened is that Ian Phillips said at the end of his paper about Sperling, oh, there are these other more recent experiments. But look, they can be explained in terms of the fact that 2 alternative forced choice tasks notoriously overestimate consciousness. And that strongly suggested that he was saying what supports performance in the partial report task is not conscious experience. So at the moment when you ask yourself about the cued stimulus, was it rectangular, was it horizontal or vertical? It's not consciousness enabling you to do it. But I don't think the cognitive hypothesis needs to say that ever. So no, it's, once you're attending to the thing, you get it as horizontal or vertical, fine.
So just a quick follow-up on this one. But you don't want to say that it's okay for a cognitive position to think that, you know, you're aware of 8, maybe not of the orientations of all 12, but of all the 12, right? Because it can't be, in some sense, it can't be more than 4 items or chunks or whatever the working memory criterion is going to be. So there's got to be some kind of.
It just, I mean, the stuff about there being 4 items in working memory, fine, right? I have no reason to deny that. I think it can be a little bit unhelpful because the evidence we've got, the clear evidence we've got about what you take up cognitively is what you report. If you report it, well, you must have taken up that information cognitively, right? That was sort of part of how we were defining the notion of cognitive in both Bloch's work and the way I've done it here. So, what you can report is not as much as, you cannot report the specific orientations of all 12 items. So the cognitive hypothesis ought not to say that you're aware of that. They might say you're aware of a little bit more than you can report because there might be more in cognition than report, but roughly speaking. But the key point here is they need not say anything like that. Yeah, so if there were some way of showing that they must be conscious of the specific orientations of all the rectangles, so what they're conscious of is not partial in the relevant sense, then yeah, the cognitive hypothesis would be in trouble. But the idea that partial report could give us evidence of that seems to me to be a non-starter.
I'm just sort of a little bit concerned whether there is any, I mean, given the argument that you're giving, whether there could be anything that we could come up with as evidence in favor of the overflow hypothesis rather than the cognitive hypothesis. So I'm just trying to put to see if the conclusion is actually, or the motivation environment is, an idea that it's going to be stronger than this. It's not only to do with reports about visible objects or introspective reports. So could you go to the characterization that you gave of the cognitive hypothesis? It's at the very beginning. Okay, so cognition occurs when information is made available for things like verbal report, voluntary action, planning, blah, blah, blah. A hell of a lot. And you've already said, look, because of the explanatory gap and a lot of our research is in its infancy, we can't really appeal to neurophysiology and a whole bunch of other bits of evidence that we might want to someday appeal to. Okay. So it's all going to be behavioral. So if we're going to get any evidence from what I'm gathering from the combination, from what you said against all those, the other kinds of evidence, it's going to come from behavior.
Or, behavior, or I might want to include features of cognition which might be distinctive in a way that isn't obviously going to be sorted by different behaviors.
Well, maybe then that's kind of what I might be aiming at. So I guess I just want to be clear on this. If you think of it, so let's suppose that it's only behavior and so on. Well, then clearly it's almost like saying, well, cognition's going to be involved because you're never going to know whether in that kind of behavior any of those things weren't part of it, right? But then I sort of think of, I think twice and three times about this, because I think perhaps, so if we think of perception as guiding action, when you think of perception, guiding action sometimes explicitly, so if I'm going to grab this, it has a lot of intentions, beliefs, and so on about the object. But there seems to be a lot of information that's not processed at that level of intentions and beliefs, but that guides your grip. For example,
so just to be so clear about the case, it might well be that in the very broad sense of reports, which means sort of evinces a voluntary action and so on, you're reaching for the bottle, sure, but evidence that you were conscious there. But evidence that you were conscious of the specific shape of the bottle such that you adjusted your grip. Yeah, no, it's much harder to get. Yeah, sure, for that reason.
Yeah. So, but in that sort of case, then my question would that count as sort of that sort of information for the grabbing and so on? Would that count? Would you be able to say, oh no, it's obvious that even for that sort of information, cognition is involved or not?
I think that's really difficult to say. That's a good question, and I don't.
Because
I've tried to set. Obviously, this is hopelessly vague, right? And the idea is that this doesn't turn. It's important to me. This doesn't turn on specific theories of working memory or the details of David Rosenthal's theory or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But so the disadvantage of it being vague is that precisely there are these cases when it's hard to say. My thought is that this stuff's going to shake out the same with respect to partial report, whatever sensible specification of this we give. Now, in the case of action, in this case, I think there's a good question whether the information that guides your specific grip is available for general purposes. It's left open by the hopeless vagueness here, but it's natural to think we're going to specify this, we're going to processify this in a way which means that no, it's not. That information is not available for general purposes, because after all, if I say to you, why did you do that? You're going to say, do what?
But then the question is, why isn't that sort of, so I wasn't sure whether you would classify that within cognition or not, because it's vague and so on. But if it's not, wouldn't that be evidence of the overflow hypothesis?
So for it to be evidence of the overflow hypothesis, we'd need evidence that did not go via report and general availability for the claim that that information was conscious. Now, I agree with you that information guiding your specific grip seems likely to be information that's available consciously, but I think that's because when you reflect on it, lots of that stuff is accessible. So really the reason for thinking that that's conscious is likely to go via cognition too.
But you need to compare it, so let's say that you compare it to the blindsided case.
Yeah.
And it seems to be radically different. I mean, the case of the blindsided case, it guides certain actions, gives in some sort of report or however the case is designed. But this seems to be a very different sort of case.
Absolutely, and I agree, but I think that's because though in a particular case where you reach, the information is not, we don't have really clear evidence that it's globally available. Well, there are other cases where we have some pretty good evidence it's globally available. You could tell me about it, for instance. So, well, if you really wanted the cognitive hypothesis, you'd say something like, well, look, we know that we've got pretty good evidence that this information is conscious when you tell me about it. But in that other case, when you were just reaching, was that aspect really so different from the blindside case? And that's something that people do say.
Well,
I'm not saying they're right. But
yeah, but then I think that's, there's a sense I almost get about the cognitive hypothesis. So this is where I think, oh, well, that can always, because once you've reported it, that's it.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm trying, and I know you're going against reports, so partial reports, but I'm trying to say, well, is there a possibility of there being some source of evidence behaviorally? Now, this seems to be a sort of possibility, unless you redefine what cognition.
What I don't understand is how, I should preface this by saying, look, if you put a gun to my head and say choose, I'd say I overthrow hypothesis. Because I think we shouldn't be wasting this money on the partial report paradigm for that purpose. It's good for other purposes. Anyway, sorry. But so just to take up the view of the cognitive hypothesis here, in that kind of case, when the information is globally available, for instance, you can tell me about it. We've got good evidence that it's conscious, uncontroversial evidence, let's say. In a case, if we've got good reason to suppose that there are cases where it guides action without counting as globally available according to the right specification of this criteria, then the cognitive hypothesis person should say, why do you think it's conscious there? As well as in this other case when you do make it globally available. But look, so I think that's what they should say about that case. It's why this isn't obviously false in light of, or isn't false in light of this kind of case. Clearly false in light of this kind of case. But I do think that exactly that kind of thing is actually a more promising way to think about evidence that consciousness is independent of cognition. So we're looking at a functional role for consciousness, not in terms of a very low-level computational role or a physiological role. We're looking at ordinary things that we take every day to be parts of the explanatory role of consciousness. Some of them will have to go, some of them will be mistakes. But we have plenty of platitudes we ordinarily work with. Ways in which conscious experience guides action, ways in which it enables us to have certain kinds of inarticulate thoughts about that object or that colour and so on. And those sorts of things, I think, could well give us admittedly defeasible evidence that in order for consciousness to have the functional role lots of productive theories take it to have, it would have to be independent of cognition. And the action case might be exactly like that.
Okay, so maybe what my problem was with the idea that the only uncontroversial evidence, and I think all we have many times is just defeasible evidence. So I don't know whether uncontroversial evidence was a meeting defeasible evidence.
No. I think uncontroversial it can be defeasible, It's just that it doesn't depend on any of these particular theories we're trying to choose between. So for instance, it seems to me that the kinds of things we're able to think and so report
Yeah.
do give us really good defeasible evidence.
Okay.
I have a question. I'm not sure that I follow all the details of this exchange, but I have a related question. The question is following. Short of closing, somehow closing the explanatory gap, is there a way to decide between these two hypotheses or not?
Well, so I think it's even worse, right? Because it might be that we get lucky with the explanatory gap, and somehow some genius working on the mind-body problem says, consciousness, it has this kind of subjective character which naturally fits in with the physical world in this way, and so we're done. But much more likely, we're going to need to identify the mechanisms of consciousness first before we can make progress. We're going to have to come at it from both directions, so to speak. That's what even Nagel suggested, right? In the classic paper. We're going to have to get more precise about the physiology and more precise about what consciousness itself is. And I agree we have to do both those things, but that would mean getting around this problem for the physiology first, on the face of it. It might not, but on the face of it, it would. So I think, in terms of how bad the problem is, I think it's really bad in that way. But I do also think, as I was saying to Maite, the problem is that this way of trying to get evidence that there's consciousness independently of cognition trades on the idea that only consciousness could play certain functional roles, giving us kinesa grouping, that kind of perceptual unity, giving us the input to certain judgments about colour and so on that various Usher colleagues work on. And all of that stuff seems to me to be much too low level. The idea that only consciousness could play those roles would require a solution to this problem, the explanatory gap, or something close to it. Whereas there are other functional roles consciousness plays in our lives, epistemological roles even, epistemic roles even, sorry, that we might more productively appeal to without being able to solve this problem.
Yes. Looks like you know.
Dennis asks a lot of questions.
I have a short one. I just was thinking about if partial report is the wrong place to look for evidence. Can you be a little bit propositive? Where could be the right place? You mentioned physiology, dreams, but what do you think? Which is the right place to find?
So one thing that Miguel and I have been discussing as part of the project we're doing together is that we've been discussing several things, but one of them is that the kind of very minimal transparency that I want to appeal to at the end, and I appeal to in other work, that might be something that gives us evidence against the cognitive hypothesis. So in a very rough outline, the thought would be like this. For reasons I won't elaborate on now, I talked about here a week ago. I think there's good evidence that your experiences of, say, something's shape can differ slightly without you being able to tell that those experiences differ. Now, if that's the case, then a view which says what it takes for information to be conscious, or for you to be conscious of information, is for that information to be globally available. On the face of it, that view has a serious explanatory burden to discharge. It has a serious problem. Because if information is globally available, well, it should be available to higher order detection. So if you have different information that you're conscious of for this stimulus than for this stimulus, that difference, if the cognitive hypothesis is true, should on the face of it be a difference that you can detect in yourself. The information is globally available, it's available to mechanisms for reporting on your own states. So it would be natural to suppose that you would be able to tell that there's this difference in how you're seeing the two stimuli. But if I'm right that there are cases where you get different information from two stimuli. In consciousness, you're conscious of the two stimuli differently, but you cannot tell that you're conscious of them differently. On the face of it, that's a point against the cognitive hypothesis. And that's it. So if I had to run an argument for the overflow hypothesis, that would be my gambit.
Thanks.
Dennis? So what would you say to someone who wanted to argue the following way? Suppose we had reason to believe that visual perception is, analog and pretty specific. So that, as a matter of fact, you can't see a shape without seeing its size and seeing its orientation, something like that.
Okay.
Perception, right? And now they're
Conscious perception?
No.
Okay.
And now they're going to say, well, look, people tell us that they actually saw, the specifics saw each and every one of the stimuli in the partial report paradigms, right? That matches what we know by hypothesis about perception in general. So it seems, we have some reason for thinking that actually, that's what they did see consciously, right? So now we need for someone to give us reason to think that that was not so. So that it's kind of like a burden of proof type of argument. And it doesn't establish anything.
So your idea is that what the subjects report introspectively is, I saw the specific shapes of all the rectangles,
Something like that.
the specific orientations, even
But I
though
can't tell you what they are.
Okay. So that kind of introspective report, I think, first of all, would require, for that to be a factive introspective report, right? So for it to tell you how things really were in experience, introspection would have to have this weird structure that I'm arguing it doesn't have. Because it would have to be the case that that you had a way of accessing the fact that you saw things specifically without just taking up the specific
That's what my
information.
second question is about. Go ahead.
Now, so there are people who say that. Ned says that. Oh yeah, I see the specific shapes. The other thing to say about that, I think, is that I always say this, but I do think it's important. When you reflect on your experience of a rectangle, or of all the rectangles shown briefly, of course there's something you find which you take to be either vertical or horizontal, the rectangle. And if someone says, oh, I could introspect, that it wasn't just the rectangle, but my experience, which was specifically horizontal or vertical, rather than just not specifying between the two. So they're thinking of their experience as a kind of picture which has this in it. Well, the natural thing to say is, how on earth could you tell if your experience was that kind of picture, as opposed to it just being the world that you were finding when you tried to introspect? Right, so
But there's nothing in the world anymore, right? Because the thing is gone, right? The display's gone.
but you're you can be conscious of things in the world, and you can tell me about things in the world, even after they've gone. Stars are the obvious examples. In the partial report paradigm, it's pretty clear that on any theory, you are conscious of the orientation of the cube rectangle, even though the cube came after the thing had gone. So on any theory, that has to be true, right? The question is just whether that consciousness resides in non-cognitive or cognitive processes. But so I don't think the fact that the presentation is actually offset seriously undermines the claim that you're conscious of the thing in the world and able to tell me about the thing in the world.
So I think you were like responding, so you were trying to undermine, the import of subjects' reports, which is, I'm grateful for that because I wanted to ask you about it. But I was more interested about, what would the supposed fact about unconscious perception, how would that bear on the overall best explanation of all the data if they also reported they saw everything.
Oh, if they reported this, okay, so because, like I said, there are people who do that, right?
So,
But then, like they saw people who say, I saw specifically what orientation it had. I just can't tell you what orientation it was. People who say that tend to say that because they've been working on the overflow hypothesis. So I think we should be careful about their introspective reports. But so certainly the report that Ned originally cited, they see all of the letters, they see all of the rectangles, doesn't say that. It doesn't say that they saw the specific orientations they had and so on. So, but yes, if someone reports that they saw what specific orientation it had, first of all, someone who believes the cognitive hypothesis has to deny that, in the case of the partial report experiment. Right, so for one of the rectangles, if someone says in a partial report experiment, I saw what orientations all 8 rectangles had, on the face of it, the cognitive hypothesis person has to deny that. I also think that it's very plausible to deny that, because introspection would have to have this very weird structure, were it the case. So then I'm naturally looking for another explanation. Well, why would someone say that, even though introspection would have to have this implausible structure? Well, the natural diagnosis is, when they introspect, they do find a thing, which is either horizontal or vertical. It's the rectangle out in the world. So you ask yourself about your experience and you find the object of experience. And then one thing that I think happens to people is they think, oh, that's my experience, right? Everything which is a feature of the object must be a feature of my experience. No, the whole point of the cognitive hypothesis really is to say, no, it's only those aspects of the world that you take up cognitively.
So you would say that basically whatever fact, supposed fact about the specificity of perception in general wouldn't bear on this dispute, because one could always say, well, the detail got lost on the way of becoming conscious.
I said sorry. I was forgetting to hear your say perception in non-consciously. Yes. No, that's my fault.
Our fault.
This is a very English conversation. In a way, so the way you were getting at the claim that the non-cognitive information that's in perception is specific with respect to orientation was via a general principle that it always is, or something like that. What the partial report experiments do is give us reason to think that in these particular cases, there is specific information in the visual system. So let's say it's perceived, I don't mind, about whether each stimulus is horizontal or vertical. So that's just a different route to the same starting point. As far as I can see, well, that's fine by the lights of the cognitive hypothesis. We know there's more information processed visually than you take up cognitively. Partial report experiments strongly suggest that. Well, we also know that, just lots of other reasons too. The question is just, why on earth should we think that's conscious?
So Sibos tells me that we're at the end.
Thanks very much.